Night, December 11th, 1944. Over the black waters of Ormoc Bay, small shadows slice through the waves. No bigger than fishing boats, wooden hulls shaking under engines that scream like caged beasts. The Japanese once laughed at them, calling them toys of the American Navy. But on this night, those toys would turn the sea into a graveyard of steel. They were the devil boats, the smallest, fastest, and most reckless vessels of the Pacific. No armor, no comfort, only speed, fire, and nerve. As Japan's final convoy moved across the waters of Leyte, they did not know that every wave concealed a gun, and the sky above no longer belonged to them. This story begins in failure and ends with something far darker than victory, the silence of an empire starving to death. December 1944, while snow fell over Tokyo and half the Pacific burned, a small inlet on the western edge of Leyte, Ormoc Bay, quietly decided the fate of thousands. A Japanese officer who survived later wrote 4 words in his diary: "The sea is dead." There was no glory here, only smoke, oil, and drifting bodies. Yet in this forgotten corner of water, America's wooden patrol boats, once mocked and dismissed, rewrote the logic of naval war. Ormoc was no grand clash of carriers or battleships. It was a silent blockade fought in darkness, when 24-meter boats raced through shallow water at 40 knots, armed with 4 torpedoes and faith that speed could replace armor. Japan was desperate. The Americans, exhausted but determined, were about to cut the last artery of an empire. To understand Ormoc, we must rewind 2 months, to October 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines at Leyte Gulf. For the United States, Leyte was a bridgehead to victory, the key to choking Japan's supply routes from Southeast Asia. For Japan, holding Leyte meant survival. Tokyo ordered convoys codenamed TA-1 through TA-9 to deliver reinforcements. Men, rice, ammunition. Each sailed into the same trap. American codebreakers already knew their routes. Submarines and aircraft turned those routes into corridors of death. Still, Tokyo commanded, "Send 35,000 men, at any cost." That cost would be blood and iron. Japan scraped together decrepit destroyers and coastal escorts. Kamikaze units were born from this desperation. What they could not foresee was that their enemy's deadliest weapon was not a ship of steel, but a boat made of plywood. PT stood for Patrol Torpedo. They were built by Elko Works of New Jersey, crafted not from metal, but laminated wood. 78 feet long, weighing barely 50 tons, fragile enough to splinter under one shell, yet powered by twin Packard V-12s that screamed at more than 1,500 horsepower each. They were faster than anything afloat, and invisible where radar failed. At first, High Command treated PT boats as scouts or couriers. They carried mail, supplies, and sometimes only courage. Their crews nicknamed them coffins on water. But men like John Bulkley, Robert Kelly, and a young John F. Kennedy transformed ridicule into legend. They fought knowing that a single 20-millimeter shell could ignite 3,000 gallons of fuel beneath their feet. They fought because, without them, Japan's convoys would live. In 1942, PT crews had failed miserably at the Solomons. Their torpedoes, Mark 13s, ran too deep, missed, or struck without exploding. Japanese sailors mocked them American mosquitoes with sirens. For months, U.S. reports of defective torpedoes were ignored. Only after countless deaths did engineers rebuild the weapon's shallower run, mechanical detonator, balanced fins. By 1944, the Mark 13 was reborn. No longer a failure, but a predator's tooth. Transformation took less than 2 years, and Ormoc Bay would become the proof that the toys had turned into monsters. From hidden bases in San Pedro Bay, the PT Squadron 33 waited. 12 boats concealed beneath palm trees, hulls smeared with mud for camouflage. By day they slept. By night they became phantoms. Engines roared to life after dusk, exhaust muffled by seawater, only a dim green signal lamp to keep formation. When they fired, the boats shook violently, brass casings rolling across the deck, gunpowder mingling with salt. December 10th, radar operators picked up another convoy, 4 destroyers, 8 transports, hundreds of troops, heading straight into the bay. Lieutenant Harry Griffin, commander of PT-223, gave a single order before leaving harbor. Tonight, they'll learn wood can kill. 2 a.m. The northeast wind swept across the bay. Japanese ships moved in single file, lights out, red lamps blinking faintly. They never saw the Americans coming. At 900 yards, Griffin gave the signal. 4 torpedoes hissed into the blackness. 10 seconds later, a flash. The transport Usuzuki exploded into a column of fire. Fuel drums burst, raining flames on the water. PT boats weaved through the chaos, their twin mount point .50 cals spitting tracers. Japanese gunners fired blindly into shadows that vanished before their turrets could turn. Griffin's after-action report read, "No more sea, only liquid hell." For the next 2 weeks, from December 3rd to 17th, PT boats, B-25 skip bombers, and submarines annihilated nearly every Japanese convoy that entered Ormoc Bay. Survivors named it the Sea of Demons. They swore they could recognize the growl of a Packard engine before the attack began. Ormoc was shallow, narrow, and merciless. Large ships couldn't turn, small boats could vanish. PT crews struck, disappeared, and struck again. Ghosts that turned tides. By mid-December, over 90 Japanese vessels lay destroyed or burning. Leyte's supply line was gone. 50,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped inland, starving, diseased, forgotten. All because of boats made of wood. Most PT crewmen were barely 25. Few expected to live a year. They had no medals waiting, only orders. One sailor wrote to his mother, "We are just small pieces of wood on a big ocean, but at least we still float." That phrase became the squadron's quiet motto. Their courage held the blockade when steel alone could not. At sunrise, December 14, 1944, smoke still hung over the bay. Burning wrecks drifted like black islands. PT-223 limped home, engines coughing. A young officer looked back at the sea and whispered, "The ocean fed well last night." Ormoc was calm again, but changed forever. It became the model of modern littoral warfare. Small, fast units working with air and intelligence, the foundation of future naval strategy. The victory at Ormoc severed Japan's lifeline to Leyte and shattered the myth that only great ships decide great wars. History remembers the giants, Yamato, Musashi, Enterprise. But sometimes the war was decided by things that barely stayed afloat. At Ormoc, plywood sank steel, and the tide of the Pacific began to turn for good. Before dawn, December 11th, 1944, the dark waters of Ormoc Bay glowed faintly orange. Dozens of fires still burned from the previous night. Drifting wrecks, oil slicks, bodies floating face down. The air reeked of gasoline and salt. Yet somewhere beyond that smoke, the Japanese were coming again. Convoy TA-9, 10 ships loaded with troops, rice, and ammunition, had left Manila 2 days earlier. It was Japan's final attempt to reinforce Leyte. Every officer aboard knew the truth. There would be no rescue if they failed. At 4 a.m., an American radar screen aboard PT-490 flickered alive. Dozens of dots appeared, moving south. Lieutenant Jack Britt, the boat's skipper, grinned grimly. "They're still trying. Good, let's finish it." The night hunt began again. Ormoc Bay was a trap, a narrow basin surrounded by mountains, open only to the south. The Americans had turned it into a killing ground. To the west, submarines prowled like sharks. From the sky, B-25 Mitchell bombers waited for daylight. And across the shoreline, PT squadrons 33 and 36 formed a living net. Their radar screens scanning every flicker of movement, their Packard engines idling like sleeping predators. Each squadron worked from a box, a designated grid sector. Every 4 boats covered a 5-mile square, using radio silence and signal lamps to coordinate. They were not large enough to hold ground, but they were fast enough to own the night. That night, the hunters smelled blood again. At 2:35 a.m., PT-490's radar man whispered, "Targets, 12 miles, bearing 215. Within minutes, the other boats aligned. Engines throttled up. The surface of the bay trembled from synchronized acceleration. The first torpedoes left their tubes with a hiss like tearing silk. Seconds later, impact. The Japanese destroyer Uzuki vanished in a ball of fire. Debris rained on nearby transports. Men screamed in the dark, their voices swallowed by the roar of flames. PT-491 swung wide and fired again. Another ship, CH-53, an escort vessel, exploded amidships. The rest of the convoy scattered, turning in panic toward the coast. One Japanese survivor recalled later, "The sea was full of red lines, tracer bullets. They came from nowhere. When we fired back, the night itself moved." By dawn, 7 Japanese ships were sinking or burning. American pilots arriving at sunrise finished what the PTS had begun. Skip bombers swooped in at mast height, their 500-pound bombs bouncing across the waves before punching through hulls. From the cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell, Lieutenant Robert Chin wrote in his log, "We followed the smoke. The bay looked like a field of volcanoes. Behind them, destroyers USS Waller, USS Renshaw, and USS Pringle closed the jaws of the trap. Their radar-guided guns turned the water into boiling mist. Within 2 hours, Convoy TA-9 ceased to exist. The last radio signal from a Japanese ship said simply, 'Under attack, everything burning.'" For Japan, Ormoc Bay had become more than a battlefield. It was a graveyard of hope. The loss of the Ormoc convoys broke the back of Japan's defense in the Philippines. Without supplies, the 35th Army on Leyte began to collapse. Soldiers starved, ammunition ran out, and disease spread through the jungles. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, understood what Tokyo refused to admit. From his mountain command post at Baguio, he radioed a final warning. "Without the sea, we cannot fight." But the sea no longer belonged to Japan. Every attempt to resupply ended the same way. Burning ships, dying men, and the echo of Packard engines in the night. Ormoc Bay marked the irreversible turning point of the Philippines campaign. From this moment, Japan could only defend and die. For the PT crews, victory was measured not in medals, but in survival. They lived by a simple code: nothing gets through. Each patrol lasted 12 to 14 hours. They navigated without lights, in shallow water barely deep enough to hide. A single mistake, a sandbar, a misread radar return could end in fire. Fuel fumes soaked their clothes. The smell of cordite clung to their hair. They slept in hammocks above torpedoes, half drunk on adrenaline and salt air. Yet they fought with relentless precision. Their training turned chaos into choreography. Torpedo crews reloading by hand, gunners firing blind, captains steering through burning oil. A machinist's mate later said, "It was madness, but it worked. We didn't outgun them. We just never missed twice." The real genius of Ormoc lay not in one weapon, but in coordination. For the first time in history, aircraft, surface craft, and submarines operated as one. Radio frequencies were standardized. Torpedo angles and bombing altitudes were synchronized. Intelligence from codebreakers in Australia arrived within hours, not days. This was modern warfare, the birth of joint operations. At 9 a.m., December 12th, American B-25 struck again. PT boats marked targets with tracer fire, while bombers dropped from the clouds. The sky and the sea moved together. The Japanese had no answer. A U.S. Navy report described it in one line: target area annihilated. By mid-December, the Japanese high command accepted what no one dared say aloud. Ormoc Bay was lost. Every ship sent there disappeared. Pilots refused to fly into the inferno. Sailors whispered the name with fear: Devil Bay. From Manila, desperate orders continued to arrive. Deliver supplies, reinforce the garrison. But there was nothing left to deliver, no ships capable of reaching the shore alive. The few that tried never returned. For the Americans, there was no celebration. When dawn broke on December 15th, PT crews found the sea coated with oil and ash. Bodies floated beside half-submerged barges. The air was still. Lieutenant Harry Griffin wrote in his log, "Victory has no sound, only silence." The same silence that marked the end of Japan's maritime power in the Philippines. Ormoc Bay had become the place where wood defeated steel, where desperation met adaptation, and where a handful of small boats changed the shape of a war. The blockade of Ormoc starved 50,000 Japanese soldiers. Cut off from food and ammunition, they fought on with bamboo spears and empty rifles. What bombs could not destroy, hunger would. In the jungles of Leyte, American infantry discovered diaries, pages stained with rain and blood. One read, "The sea burns every night. The sky belongs to the enemy. We are buried alive on Leyte." Another, written by a Japanese lieutenant, "Our last ships did not return. We know the meaning of the word Ormoc now. It means death." Ormoc Bay was more than a victory. It was a lesson that innovation, not size, decides survival. The PT boat crews had turned weakness into strategy. They learned that speed could replace armor and intelligence could replace brute force. Admiral William Halsey, reviewing the battle, said simply, "They turned plywood into power, and that power reshaped naval warfare forever." By the end of December 1944, the Japanese Empire's defensive line had collapsed. Ormoc was no longer just a bay, it was a mirror of defeat. For every ship that sank there, 1,000 more in Tokyo's dreams went down with it. From that wreckage rose a new reality: Japan could not win. America had learned how to fight in 3 dimensions, air, surface, and sea, and could coordinate them faster than anyone else on Earth. The tide of the Pacific had turned. It would never turn back. Night after night, the bay refused to rest. Even when the last convoy had burned, the sea kept echoing with the ghosts of engines. PT crews swore they could still hear them, faint growls rising from under the waves, like the dying pulse of the war itself. Ormoc Bay had become a graveyard that never went quiet. Every patrol passed the same drifting wrecks, oil still bubbling from their seams. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with tropical rain, a stench no soap could wash away. A radio operator on PT 492 wrote in his diary, "When the wind comes from the west, you can smell death before you see it." He wasn't speaking in metaphor. The devil boats were barely 24 meters long. There was nowhere to hide from noise or fear. Engines screamed beneath the deck. Heat built until bullets and sweat shared the same metallic taste. Crews rotated 4-hour watches, sleeping beside torpedoes, dreaming of explosions. When rain flooded the deck, they bailed with helmets. When guns jammed, they cleared them barehanded. One machinist recalled, "We didn't fight the Japanese. We fought the sea, the heat, and our own nerves." Fear became routine. They joked, smoked, cursed, anything to drown the silence between bursts of violence. Yet under that routine lived exhaustion deeper than the ocean. December 14th, 1944. Ormoc erupted again. American bombers struck from the east while PT boats closed in from the west. It was supposed to be coordination. It became chaos. At 7:30 a.m., a stray bomb hit too close. The shock wave flipped PT 331. Fuel ignited instantly. The sea itself caught fire. Half her crew was thrown clear, their skin blistered by burning oil. Others disappeared beneath the flames. Lieutenant Ray Harkness, commanding PT 332, ordered his men to rescue survivors despite ongoing fire. They pulled 3 sailors aboard, skin peeling from their arms. One whispered before dying, "Tell them we got one of theirs." It wasn't vengeance. It was confession. By the end of that morning, PT 331 was gone. One of the few devil boats never recovered. For the Japanese trapped on Leyte, the world had shrunk to the size of hunger. Food ran out in January 1945. Rations fell from rice to grass, from grass to leaves. Men boiled leather, scraped mold from helmets, fought over rainwater. They listened to the sea every night, hoping for the sound of engines bringing supplies. But only the devil boats came. When gunfire flashed offshore, they knew another convoy had died. A captured diary found later contained a single line, "Even the sea betrays us now." The blockade was complete. No bullets were needed to kill what starvation had already claimed. Victory did not spare the Americans from torment. What they witnessed at Ormoc carved itself into memory. Men screaming in oil, ships breaking apart, faces lit by burning fuel. Sailor Tom Reese of P223 described it years later. "You smell them burn and you keep shooting because if you stop, they shoot you. Then it's over and you realize you're still pulling the trigger." When missions ended, silence felt unbearable. Many refused to sleep, fearing dreams louder than battle. Some drank whatever they could find. Others simply stared at the dark horizon until dawn. Naval doctors began noting combat fatigue. No one called it trauma yet, but the term hell within fit better than any diagnosis. On December 16th, PT-490 picked up a distress flare, a downed B-25 crew. Lieutenant Britt ordered full speed toward the smoke, unaware that Japanese shore batteries were waiting. 3 shells hit the waterline, fuel tanks ruptured, flames tore across the deck. The bomber crew never made it. PT-490 limped back to base, its paint scorched black. The next day they returned to the same spot and found only floating helmets. Griffin, commanding PT-223, wrote in his report, "We rescue who we can. The rest stay with the bay." The bay had its own rules. No one came out unscarred. By Christmas 1944, the once tropical paradise around Ormoc was a wasteland. Mangroves were charred, villages flattened, beaches littered with twisted metal. The water glowed faintly at night. Phosphorus stirred by wreckage beneath. Divers reported eerie sights. Entire decks intact, sailors frozen where they died. One diver surfaced shaking, whispering, "They're still down there sitting at their guns." For the locals, the sea had turned into a forbidden place. Fishermen refused to cast nets. Their catches came up tangled in bones. Even after combat ceased, crews on patrol could not escape the sound. Packard engines haunted them. Their pitch, a rising howl between 3,000 and 3,600 RPM, became the rhythm of survival. After the war, veterans said they could hear it in heavy rain, in traffic, even in dreams. Psychologists decades later called it auditory imprint, a ghost made of frequency and fear. For the men of the Devil boats, it was the voice of Ormoc itself. On January 3, 1945, radar picked up moving contacts in the bay. 6, maybe 8. Boats deployed immediately. They found nothing. No ships, no wakes, no debris. But the blips returned the next night and the next. Old sailors believed the radar was haunted, replaying echoes of the last Japanese convoy. They called it the Ghost Convoy. An engineer later discovered the cause: reflections from oil slicks and wrecked masts under the surface. Yet the men preferred the legend. It fit what they already knew. The sea remembers. By mid-January, survivors on Leyte began surrendering in groups of 10, 20, 50, starving, skeletal, carrying white rags on bamboo sticks. Some crawled into American camps just to die among strangers. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, captured near the coast, could barely speak. He whispered to an interpreter, "We thought help would come from the sea." But the sea burned. The interpreter cried while translating. No one had the strength to hide humanity anymore. Back at San Pedro Bay, PT crews cleaned their hulls in silence. Orders came to prepare for new missions around Cebu and Mindoro, but something inside them had shifted. They had won, completely, decisively, and it felt like loss. Lieutenant Griffin admitted in his final log entry, "I can't remember what we were trying to save. I just know we kept them from getting through." No headlines mentioned their names. No parades waited at home. Their reward was the quiet knowledge that they had helped in something monstrous, even as it consumed them. By February 1945, Ormoc Bay was clear of enemy ships. The Americans moved north toward Luzon. The Devil boats followed. But the war had changed them. The fear no longer came from the enemy. It came from inside. Men flinched at sudden noises. Some refused to step onto docks, fearing explosions. Others kept working long after the engine stopped, as if silence were betrayal. Historians later said the PT crews burned brighter than any others. They were the thin edge of innovation and the thin edge of sanity. Out of 12 boats in the Ormoc blockade, 3 were lost. 124 crewmen killed or missing. The Japanese lost more than 10,000 sailors and soldiers in the bay. But statistics could never measure the invisible casualties, the hearts, the sleep, the peace of those who survived. Decades later, veteran Jack Britt said in an interview, "We sank their convoys, but every time we fired, a part of us went down with them. That was the real hell within, not flames, not blood, but the unbearable weight of remembering." January 1945. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but in Ormoc Bay, the guns had gone quiet. Only the wind moved across the water. The same sea that once boiled with fire now lay still, holding what it had taken. A Navy photographer flew over the bay that week. In his journal, he wrote, "Nothing moves down there, just oil rainbows and wrecks." The photographs show twisted hulls under a glass-calm surface. The sun reflected off the oil like skin over an open wound. Ormoc was finished. Japan's last gateway to the Philippines was gone, and with it, the illusion of victory. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff refused to believe the reports. Each dispatch was rewritten, softened, delayed. Words like annihilated became delayed. Losses became heavy resistance. But inside the walls of the Navy Ministry, even the most loyal officers knew Ormoc was a dead end. They had thrown convoys, destroyers, and men into a bay that no longer existed as a route, only as a grave. One admiral summed it up quietly. "We have lost the sea. Without the sea, Japan is only an island again." The empire that had conquered half the Pacific now starved in sight of its own horizon. To the Americans, the victory was almost unbelievable. No battleships, no carriers, just plywood boats, a few bombers, and coordination. At fleet headquarters, an officer scrawled across the operations map, "Plywood victory, Ormoc Bay." It wasn't bravado, it was astonishment that something so small could reshape an entire campaign. From then on, naval planners began to speak a new language. Joint operations, radar synchronization, integrated strike groups. Ormoc had proven that technology and teamwork could outthink mass and tradition. Yet every innovation carried a cost. In the PT squadrons, the men began to break down. Their patrol logs grew shorter, sentences fractured. A gunner from PT 223 wrote home, "I can't tell where the ocean ends and the oil begins. We've been breathing it for months." Many were rotated home before the campaign ended. Too exhausted to continue, too proud to ask for rest. The Navy called it fatigue. The men called it the shakes. They had survived the explosions, but not the memories. After Ormoc, Japanese shipping in the Philippines ceased completely. No more fuel, no ammunition, no food. The 35th Army on Leyte was abandoned. Across the islands, soldiers starved. Commanders sent final reports written on scraps of paper. No supplies, no orders, awaiting death. By March, over 50,000 Japanese troops were dead, most from hunger, not battle. The same sea that had once fed their empire now swallowed it. In San Pedro Bay, the PT crews were ordered to stand down. They washed their boats, patched bullet holes, and waited for the next assignment. But there was no celebration, only a strange quiet. Lieutenant Griffin walked the dock one evening and said, almost to himself, "We did our job too well. There's nothing left to fight." Victory felt like absence. The ocean was calm because everything that could burn already had. In 1955, divers returned to Ormoc to map the wrecks. They found PT hulls lying beside Japanese destroyers, enemy and ally, equal in rust. Fish swam through gun barrels. Coral grew over bullet holes. A Japanese diver surfaced in tears. He said, "The sea keeps them together now. There is no hate down there." Time had done what peace talks never could. It had buried the noise. Historians would later mark Ormoc as the first fully integrated maritime strike in modern history. Every branch, air, sea, and subsurface, operating in one rhythm. It became the blueprint for the Cold War, for Vietnam, for every coordinated operation that followed. But the real lesson wasn't tactical, it was human. That power, no matter how advanced, always ends where empathy begins to fail. A veteran summed it up at a reunion in 1960, "We learned how to fight perfectly. We never learned how to stop hearing the engines." Today, Ormoc Bay is blue again. Children swim where convoys once burned. Fishermen cast nets that sometimes catch relics, helmets, shell fragments, bone. They call it the Quiet Sea. But locals still say that on windless nights, you can hear a low hum from below the water. The ghost of Packard engines turning in eternal patrol. The waves roll, the coral glows, and history sleeps beneath a thin layer of peace. War historians call Ormoc a decisive engagement, a masterpiece of coordination. Sailors call it something else, a mirror, because when they looked into the oil-stained water after the battle, they saw not victory, not vengeance, but themselves. And in that reflection lay the truest legacy of the Devil boats. That even the smallest craft, driven by courage and desperation, could change the course of empires. but never escape the weight of what they had done.